Welcome, welcome, Dr. Mark Coppenger, to the Bible Professor podcast. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So you wrote an essay for our volume 18 of the SES Christian Apologetics Journal. I put your essay in there first for a couple of reasons. I'll get to it, but you had also contributed a chapter to the Festschrift I edited in honor of Richard Land on Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Ethicists Unless. And your section titles were pretty creative. In the church, one might be surrounded by drama queens, well-intentioned dragons, and feigning flowers. Next section, not to mention quislings and breathless ingratiators. And on it goes. So, and pity the fool who doesn't have or use the Bible. Anyway, I appreciate you. Your essay you wrote here is on critical theory. Your title is Why Critical Race Theory and Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Should Be Renamed. I put your essay, your article first in our journal because, Dr. Coppenger, you're a great writer. You
Thanks.
are a great writer, a philosophy professor, ethicist, and this is cutting edge stuff, the DEI stuff especially. And so you're saying both of these things should be renamed.
Right.
And specifically, well, let me read your opening line first. Critical race theory and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion have been all the rage in America, marching orders for and by our cultural elites and their operatives in the media, the military, the corporate world, and our schools. And you say they need to be renamed to vandalizing racialist stipulation and debilitation, confiscation, and relativism. Why do you think CRT and DEI need to be renamed to those names?
Well, I would say we'll just say the woke or liberals, language twisting and euphemism and diffamism, that's their stock and trade. So we would have, gender affirming surgery or something for mutilation of children, pro-choice for, killing babies in the womb and so forth. So they have really dressed it up in that, and they use some nice words, but in fact, it's just contrary to what's actually the case. They're toxic, and so I suggest those alternative readings. We turn it everywhere. If you have an objection to the gay agenda, you're homophobic, and it just goes on and on and on. And of course, I say there that the all-purpose solution, the universal solvent, is the word racist. You can throw that on somebody, and then you just erase their ability. So it's a language game they play, and I push back.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in here, that it is a language game, and you did your homework, Dr. Coppenger. Obviously, you quote, Neil Shenvi, you quote Stefanczyk, you quote on the positive side, Heather McDonald, you quote Derek Bell and Thomas Sowell, and it goes on and on. You go all the way back to D'Angelo, Abraham X. Kendi, all these guys and gals, and at your age, you were able also in your essay to go back decades ago to where a lot of this started here in the States.
Yeah, I moved a lot of books out here for my year of teaching here in Idaho because I've been working on a project right along. It's a book, and I've called it I Heard a Dream instead of I Have a Dream. Going back, I heard the Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech on black and white TV. I was home from school that day, I think it was, and I was just there listening to that. And it just was really stunning. It was spellbinding. It says, I have a dream that, you'll be judged by the content of your character instead of the color of your skin. And I said, yes. My mom was a Michigander, so she was going to high school with blacks in the 1920s. And my dad was from East Tennessee, where there weren't slaves up in the mountains there. And so they were very committed from the get-go to integration. They were not segregationists. And the South was filled with Dixiecrats, I guess you could say racist Democrats like Orville Faubus in Arkansas and George Wallace in Alabama. And so I was raised cheering for integration. Those are my heroes. I mean, it's Marian Anderson, the opera singer, and Jackie Robinson and all this kind of thing. And so I was all on board. And then I wake up one day and you got Al Sharpton, or, like, what happened? This is not the dream. And then you've got the reverse discrimination, affirmative action, and then all this wokeness and hair-triggered stuff. And let's recast the history of America in the 1619 Project. And I thought, what in the wide world of sports has happened? And so I'd been reading on this, and I think I had probably about 200 books in this collection I'm using to write. And then you come along and say, how about this? And I said, yes, that's great. So, yeah, I didn't start with, a standing jump when you contacted me. I've been reading in this area.
Yeah, obviously you have. I mean, this is a well-researched piece, and I really appreciate it. You say on CRT, you say, on matters of race, CRT advocates themselves are all over the place disputing with one another.
Yeah.
And so you quote Delgado and Stefanchik about they say, quote, critical theorists reject the black-white binary in large part because they reject the notion that African Americans have always been and continue to be the most racially subordinated group in America, end quote. But the author says these theorists blunder in their attempt to accommodate Asians and Indians, and so he pushes back, saying there's good reason to focus overwhelmingly on blacks. And in another piece, you have the Berkeley law professor Ian Haney Lopez, as you know, he said, well,
and you're shortchanging the Hispanics. Come on, man.
What about the Hispanics, right? And so on and on it goes. And so you have inner strife even within the CRT movement.
Right.
Interesting.
Exactly. And you get with intersectionality, you could say, I mean, my alma mater, graduate school alma mater, Vanderbilt, worked really hard at intersectionality in appointing the divinity school dean when I came back to Nashville from Chicago. She was a black lesbian. It's like, oh my, they got a twofer there, It's like, well, she's much more persecuted than simply a black woman. If she's a lesbian, there's another group, and then I suppose if she were mobility impaired, that would have been even better. So you have these hierarchies among these folks over persecution, and you've got it easy compared. And it's really a nasty mess.
Yeah, interesting. And what about? I'd like for you to comment on. Of course, you even go back to the philosopher Karl Popper as well, but and Freud. You mentioned him, but then you said I'd like you to comment on this. CRT crusader Derek Bell, who was black, played the game by saying terrible things about white people's souls, their pathetic and even vicious defense mechanisms. He said, even the poorest whites, those who must live their lives only a few levels above, gain their self-esteem by gazing down on us, end quote. Yeah. That's a fairly racist comment, I would think.
It is. And I connect that to, Popper said that any scientific theory or any claim in that area worth its salt needs to be falsifiable. There needs to be something that could possibly count against it. I mean, I think you could say the same about Darwinian evolution, that every time you come up with a counter thing, they have an answer. And, well, it couldn't do it in that narrow length of time. Okay, we'll add another trillion years. They can just adapt. Well, in psychology, Freud is a target of this, and he'll say, the Oedipus complex. You desired your mother, and you hated your father because he was a rival for her, even romantically, and you think, no, I didn't do that. Oh, yes, you did, and the fact you're denying it shows that you're sensitive, and they just play this game, and so people have laughed that out of court. Well, what you've got here is Bell and others doing this psychology game, like they're talking about these motives, and they're fearful, and they're resentful, and they're this and that, and you think, boy, there's nothing to count against that. I mean, the more I deny it, the more I confirm it. So to me, it's junk science.
Yeah, that's a good point. And then continuing on that, more of the junk, you said, yeah. Of course, the charge does not stop there. They move from calling whites pitiful to assigning malevolent motives to them. Ibram X. Kennedy says that Ronald Reagan declared war on him when he was in the womb, saying, quote, we can put drug abuse on the run through stronger law enforcement. why would that be a war on Ibram X. Kendi? Why would that be a war on anyone because of their race?
Yeah. Well, he says, well, you're really saying that's like dog whistle, or that's code talk for saying we need to throw more blacks in jail, because I mean, it's just finding dark motives and all kinds of things. And that's a pretty sloppy way to do work. You could just object to the content of what he says, there's one place in there where I think I put italics on an extended statement where every time they talk about a psychological state like fear or envy or hatred, I italicize it, just show that's how they were. So I could say back to you today, yeah, all right, you asked a question about Popper and Freud, but I know what you're really doing. You're really trying, because you think I don't know enough Freud, so you're trying to embarrass me by having me say something stupid about, it's like, where does that stop? Or you could stop me and say, yeah, Mark, I know you're acting like you're above it all, but you would really love to be a slave owner in the antebellum South. And the more I deny it, you say, see, I pricked you a little bit there. So it's a game they play, and you can't deny it. You can't deny your motives. You can't prove a negative. No, I didn't do it. So it's shameful.
It is. This was extremely interesting, a quote that you put in there. Well, first of all, you said back in 2011, the Chicago papers reported that the incidence of out-of-wedlock black births in the city stood at 79%. A few years later, they wrote that in Detroit, the number stood at 85%, and this 40 years after the Civil Rights Act was 1964. But on down, you give this quote, and it says, this is a public figure saying, you and I know how true this is in the African-American community. We know that more than half of all black children live in single-parent households, a number that has doubled since we were children. We know the statistics, that children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to have behavioral problems or run away from the home or become teenage parents themselves, and the foundations of our community are weaker because of it. We also need families to raise our children. Who said that, Dr. Coppenger?
That's our president, Barack Obama. I mean, he was in a moment of weakness or something like that, but he was, it's really true. I mean, that, and I've seen statistics that say at the turn of the century, the previous century, 1900s, that, black families were much more solid and the like. That was much closer to slavery than we are now. And, you could say, the outpouring of slavery and the impact has crippled the black family and stuff. No, they were doing much better in 1900, but it is just crazy. I mean, they, of course, you say the Great Society and incentives not to have a wage earner in the home because you get more aid for dependent children. There are a lot of things in play, but the family is just crazy. But when I saw Obama, I thought, wow, put that down because you're going to not support it so much down the line.
Yeah. So let me ask you and this is putting you on the spot, I suppose, but a more of a practical question before we comment on the DEI notion. More of a practical question, Dr. Coppenger, if you were to put on your pastoral hat and you're out in the community or even a church and you run into an African-American family and they're Christian and they say, we really see value in the CRT movement because they bought into it. Where would you begin to, give them some wisdom on that?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. Just as a pastor, you think, what a crazy way to live your life, just keeping score and noting all the resentments and being triggered and feeling sorry for yourself. And if some guy, a white guy came from the plant and he's working for Monsanto or something, and he's just complaining every day, and I didn't get my promotion, and my supervisor didn't appreciate this thing I did, and then I'm so uncomfortable, my break's too short. And, after a while, I would say, knowing that he was working in the plant where a lot of other people work, I would just say, you're not really helping yourself. That frame of mind is so spiritually destructive. And
yes, sir.
You pointed to Paul and said, those situations I find myself in, well, I found a way to be content with them. And that's where I'm going. Yeah, you can push back against stuff, but if your life is one of just whining, essentially, which is what this is, and grousing and being resentful and surly. That's spiritually destructive. I think the other thing is, I've hung around some pretty wonderful people who are black, who have no use for this at all. In fact, I'm going to be taping something here later on about aesthetics for out here at the college I'm working with. And here's a guy who's going to be taping named Lennox, and he came from Bodie Balcom's neck of the woods. And Bodie has pushed back against that. I can say, you ought to listen to him a while. You ought to read Thomas Sowell. You ought to, and you can go down the list of even Jason Whitlock. I mean, I just heard him. He's a sports commentator. Mm-hmm. There's so many blacks who don't buy into this. And it's really not aging very well. I mean, I'm seeing more and more in the presidential political realm. You have more and more blacks just saying, hey, we are sick and tired of being on their grievance plantation. And so I put them into some good reading.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So you did a section on inclusion and renaming. DEI is really, I see it as part 2 of CRT. Yeah, it's like second gear, and it is so horrible though. Even the public universities, some of the major ones, have canned this program. And can you just tell my listeners why are we canning DEI programs? It sounds like such a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, it's insincere. I mean, they don't want diversity, and so I was in student ministry. When I pastored in Evanston, Illinois, I was in student ministry at Northwestern University. And, the way to become leprous on campus is to be vocally evangelical and traditional. What they mean is we're going to diversify with all kinds of curious things and ideologies. And the inclusion has to do with everybody feeling welcome. I'm thinking, well, there's a professor there who denied the Holocaust, and they try to run him off a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. It's like they're selective in who they hug, and it's kind of like the Overton window. If you know that at any given time, there are things that are accepted by society and things too far out to the right, I guess you could say, and too far out to the left. And so, but it's always moving left. And so you end up punching right, saying, hey, quit being critical. We're trying to win the hearts and minds of these people. And then they kind of embrace the left. And so that's what universities are doing. So they really don't want diversity. They want people who are kind of morally relative. And they don't want everybody to feel included and warmly accepted, because
that's true.
You stick your head above the parapet and you'll find out how that goes.
They're not going to include people like you and I, Christians like you and I. So,
by the way, you look at, I have my degree in philosophy from Vanderbilt and taught there a little before I went to Wheaton, and try to find an evangelical, just traditional evangelical who would take the biblical stances on social matters and has a doctorate in philosophy. Go to philosophy departments around the country and find how many there are. There are a lot of them, but they're not at the University of Idaho. They're not at where I'm up here in Idaho. They're not at Washington State, right across the border. They're very few and far between, because they are very selective in who they think is okay to affirm and hire.
That's right. Yeah. Good point. Yes, sir. And so why do you think, just as a sort of a begin to close up shop here, why do you think on your opening page you mentioned so many evangelicals, a fair number of influential evangelicals have fallen for these CRT DEI conceits? And you mentioned the Southern Baptists, because you and I are Southern Baptists, but
right.
And the Gospel Coalition you even mentioned. Why have they fallen for this? What do you think?
Yeah, they're different theories. I think there are different reasons for this, and in some cases, the word Christ-likeness has now come to mean tender, accepting, and if you push back against something. So there's that, and then you're touched by the by the wounded people or whatever. And so some people think, oh, that's the Christian thing to do, not to draw our line or say something like, this is nonsense. So some of it is just, I heard once a lecture by a guy in Britain about the beginning of the national health system, social welfare system in England. And he said that all the Anglican bishops in the House of Lords got behind it because they were using something like, in the early church in Jerusalem, they had all things in common. And if you have Christ's Spirit, you'll do this kind of stuff. And then you get socialism. And so I think we kind of get goofy. I think some people were raised in really hardcore, Jim Crow parts of the South. And so they saw it all around. And so they just think, oh my goodness, yes. And they're overreacting to that. I think some of them want to be, I saw someone criticize a Baptist theologian once. It said he wanted to be known as Mr. Baptist. So he'd find out where the people were moving and he'd run out and get in front of them and call himself their leader. I think some people they're wanting to be, up to date and they're concerned about their brand and looks like everybody is doing this and that. And they actually, I think, want to brand themselves by being leaders in brokenness or whatever. And they don't want to be, and they're stung by the racist thing. I remember on the platform in Nashville in 2021, one of the guys got up to speak against changing the resolution to repudiate the 2019 CRT thing. And he said, the world is watching. The world is watching. Oh, okay. I call it ingratiationism. There's this theory that somehow or other, if we can ingratiate ourselves to the lost world and not turn them off, then we'll be more effective evangelistically. So J.D. Greer for a time said, I'm going to use pronouns, for the trans people. And I think all of a sudden the patron saint of Christianity is more like Barnabas today than Paul or something that, just if somebody, they're not feeling good, let's give them a hug. And that's Christ-like. And so there's just a variety of motives, but I do think there's a herd mentality.
Right.
Sometimes we get hustled into it. I mean, 2019, the CRT, thing was just, we didn't know what that was. And they hustled it in at the end and yeah, okay, I'm for that. And then they'd like to run with it. But I think it's snapping back now. The presidents hustled to say, the seminary presidents, oh, no, we didn't know. No, we don't need that. And now legislatures from Florida to, I think Idaho's done something, but to Iowa, they've said, you can't do that in the state schools. I see corporations are throwing some of their HR, DEI people overboard. They're diminishing their departments. Even the Bud Light thing blew up in their face, and Tractor Supply had one blow up. I don't think it's aging well, but
right.
I think some of these leaders are more concerned about their brand and being leaders than they are being, critically perceptive and biblically oriented. It baffled me because I'd seen them before taking heart stands here, and they just went gaga over this stuff, and
yes, sir.
It's too bad.
Yeah, it is. So, just a final point. What's the fix? And you say in your article, Americans must be ready to meet race and gender morality play with a forceful and unapologetic not so fast, or prove it, and test fast talkers on race and gender without fear. End quote. You're quoting Subotnick there on toxic diversity. Right. So what do you want to add? What can you add there about what's the fix here? What will help the church especially?
I work with a fellow named Emmanuel Camporis, retired CEO of American Standard Corporation, and he funded Kairos Journal and Bible Mesh, and just a wonderful layman. And he's just funded, essentially, a film on Bonhoeffer that's coming out in November. Okay. And I look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer trying to push back against the Third Reich and Hitler, and he ended up, of course, being hanged. Fortunately, we live in a nation that is not pushing back against the Third Reich in a way. We have still a strong evangelical presence in this. We bemoan our weakness here in America compared to the 50s, but the Brits I work with say, you have no idea. Looking at America, it seems like you're in revival, the strength of your Christian community there. And so I think that as we are pushing back and saying these things, there are a lot of people, the Lord has a lot of people. Furthermore, these guys, and we're not talking about transgender readings in the library with the kids, but these guys who are in that general party have pushed against natural law so much that even non-believers, there's some pretty famous skeptics, you might say, in terms of religion, like whatever, Bill Maher, Joe Rogan, and others like that. We're saying, not Andrew, Jordan Peterson, are saying, hey, what in the world? And so, Romans 1 says you kind of can see the nature of things, and there's a yuck factor in Romans 2:14 and 15.
Yeah,
says the law is written on it. And so there is something in us, our wiring, that helps even non-believers say, wait a second, this is great. And I'm really heartened to think that we're catching the wind that's coming along here. And
yes.
And of course, God's worked great awakenings too. And under Jonathan Edwards and the Second Great Awakening in 1858 in Wales and Scotland. And I'm just thinking the Lord may be priming us to a state of desperation where all of a sudden we fall on our knees, and even lost people can say, something's really out of whack here, and then God will do a fresh, strong work among us.
Yes, sir.
But we're not going to be hanged for saying at least not yet, for saying it. And so we ought to speak up.
Right. Yeah, that's a good word, good challenge, and a hopeful comment as well. Thank you, Dr. Coppenger, for joining me today.
Thank you.
And thank you. Yep. Thank you for your essay. Thank you for your essay for our journal. I appreciate it. We appreciate it.
Honor. Thanks, man.